So let's get started. So we know by now that kidneys possess this very unique property of regulating volume and osmolality of urine by concentrating urine and diluting urine as per the need of the body, right? So what is the purpose of this function? Being able to concentrate and dilute urine as per need. So the main purpose is to maintain osmolality and volume of body fluids within a narrow range. And this is accomplished by the kidneys, but in concert with other systems by regulating the excretion of water and sodium chloride. So we know that kidneys can produce urine with osmolality as low as 30 milliosmoles per kg water to as high as 1400 milliosmoles per kg water by changing water excretion as high as 23.3 liters per day to as low as 0.5 liters per day respectively. So just have a look at this table and you will get an idea that here, if you see, in each case the osmotic load excreted is the same, okay, which is 700 milliosmoles per day. And here if you see, the GFR is kept constant, okay, and it's the other values where the kidneys are doing a little bit of plus minus, okay, either by concentrating or diluting the urine based on the need, but your net excreted osmotic load excreted is still the same. So this is how the kidneys have a process for fine tuning the amount of urine excreted, and they can do so by either concentrating or diluting the urine as per need. Now, the principal factors for concentration and dilution of urine are: one is your antidiuretic hormone, and second is your magnitude of medullary osmotic gradient. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit excuse me, about the antidiuretic hormone. You are going to learn more about it, or you may already be learning about it while learning about your endocrine system. So here I'm just going to address the bit of the renal function of the antidiuretic hormone. Okay, so as the name suggests, it prevents diuresis and is chiefly concerned with conservation of body water. Since it also causes vasoconstriction, it's called vasopressin, or more precisely, arginine vasopressin. So we are talking about ADH, or the antidiuretic hormone. What is its action on kidney? So the main role is regulation of water balance in the body by acting on kidney, where it decreases excretion of free water. That means it has an antidiuretic and concentrating effect. And what is the site of action? So we have ADH responsive cells lining the distal convoluted tubule and collecting duct of the nephron. And ADH basically increases permeability of these cells to water. So that's what it broadly does. Now, second is your medullary osmotic gradient. So just before we go on to that, I just want to tell you two more important facts about the functioning of kidney, that at least 87% of filtered water is reabsorbed even when urine volume is 23.3 liters per day. And the reabsorption of remaining of filtered water can be varied without affecting total solute excretion. That is, when urine is concentrated, the water is retained in excess of solutes. When it is dilute, the water is lost from body in excess of solutes, as we saw in this table. Now going on to medullary osmotic gradient. So now the interstitial fluid of medulla is critically important in concentrating urine, because osmotic pressure of this fluid provides the driving force for reabsorbing water from both the descending thin segment and the collecting duct. Okay. Now, the normal osmolality of plasma and other body fluids is about 300 milliosmoles per kg water. The interstitial fluid of renal cortex has same osmolality as that of plasma, and all the osmoles attribute to sodium chloride. The osmolality of renal medulla is higher than the plasma. Remember, it is hyperosmolar, okay, and it goes on increasing progressively from 300 milliosmoles per kg water at the corticomedullary junction to about 1200 milliosmoles per water at the papilla. Okay, you can see here that at the cortex, the osmolality, as I said, is pretty much same as that of plasma. Okay, but as we are going down further into the medulla, the osmolality is progressively increasing from 300, which was here at the corticomedullary junction, to about 1200 at the papilla. Okay, and this is the medullary. This forms this difference here between the osmolality. It forms the medullary gradient. Okay, and this is where a maximally concentrated urine is excreted. Okay. Now, this hyperosmolality and the medullary gradient is generated and maintained by a system which we will learn shortly about, called as the counter current system. So, what is the counter current system? To understand how a counter current system actually works, let's imagine a system. Okay, as you can see in the diagram here, something similar that happens by the effect of a heater on a straight water pipe and a pipe bent in U shape. So, first of all, a counter current system refers to a system in which inflow runs parallel to, counter to, and in close proximity to outflow for some distance. Okay, that's what it means, that this inflow is running parallel to or counter to or in close proximity to outflow for some distance, right? Now, a countercurrent system is formed by U-shaped tubules, okay? And to understand that is why we are going to look at the effect of a heater on a straight pipe and a pipe bent in U shape. Now, suppose the heater raises the temperature of a flowing fluid through the straight tube at a constant rate by 10 constant flow rate CFR by 10 degrees centigrade. Okay, so let's say from 30 to 40, this is your heater, and in a straight pipe there is water, and it's getting heated at a constant flow rate by 10 degrees centigrade. Okay, so the temperature is getting raised from 30 degrees centigrade to 40 degrees centigrade in this diagram. Now, if the pipe is bent in the same pipe is bent in a U shape, okay, and the two limbs are brought in close proximity, okay, so then see the outcome is still the same, okay, as in the starting temperature was 30 degrees centigrade, the temperature at the end of the tube, okay, is still 40 degrees centigrade, as was the case in the straight pipe. Okay, but the gradient of temperature which is set up along the pipe is in such a way that at the bend of the pipe, the temperature here, the temperature is not raised from 30 to 40 as happened here, but actually from 30, starting from 30 to almost 100 degrees centigrade. This is because the outgoing fluid, it warms the incoming fluid and sets up the counter current system. I hope this is clear to you all, that the outflow, the heated up fluid which is going in the outflow is in turn heating up the inflow fluid, right? So overall, this temperature gradient has really gone up from 30 degree to 100. And even though we get the same end result at the outflow, at the end of the outlet, which is 40 degrees centigrade. So just to give you an idea that how the counter current system actually works. We'll see that later in actual terms of what happens in the kidney. Now the counter current system, it has two components, okay? And the structures which form the counter current system are loop of Henle and vasa recta. These are the two main structures. And what are these two components? So one is your counter current multiplier, okay, which I've written as CCM here. It is formed by the operation of loop of Henle and responsible for production of hyperosmolality and gradient in the renal medulla. Okay, and then we have the counter current exchanger. This is formed by the vasa recta and responsible for maintenance of medullary gradient and hyperosmolality. So your multiplier is actually producing the hyperosmolality and the gradient in the medulla, okay? And your exchanger is maintaining this medullary gradient and the hyperosmolality which has been set up, which has been produced by the multiplier, okay? So let's go further. Now you're starting with the counter current multiplier. So as I said, it operates in loop of Henle and is responsible for the hyperosmolality, for generating hyperosmolality and the medullary gradient. And it does so by two processes. One is origin of single effect and second is multiplication of single effect. Now let's go through them one by one. So what is the origin of single effect? So this is the main driving force behind the counter current multiplier. It is a name given to the osmolality gradient of approximately 200 milliosmoles that exists between ascending limb of loop of Henle, okay, ascending limb of loop of Henle and the surrounding interstitial fluid, okay. And now these are the juxtamedullary nephrons, which are more important for production of medullary hyperosmolality. The cortical nephrons, they contribute to production of hyperosmolality in outer medulla mainly. And the mechanism of single effect in outer medulla is different from that in inner medulla. Okay, so what is the effect of single? What is the origin of single effect? Basically, it's the main driving force, and it is approximately the osmotic gradient of 200 milliosmol existing between the ascending limb of loop of Henle and the surrounding interstitium, okay, interstitial fluid. Now, what is the mechanism of origin of single effect in outer medulla? So first we learn about what happens, how the single effect operates in the outer medulla. So now your thick ascending, this is your thick ascending limb of loop of Henle. We know that it is located in the outer medulla and not in the inner one. And we also know by now that this is impermeable to water. So sodium chloride and other solutes actively absorbed in this segment are done so without absorption of water, right? So as a result of that, the tubular fluid, okay, the fluid within the ascending limb, the osmolality falls and it falls lesser than that of the plasma, okay. Why did that happen? Because we know that this part of the ascending limb of loop of Henle is impermeable to water. So now your sodium chloride and other solutes did get absorbed, but without any water accompanying them. So because of that, whatever fluid is in the tubule, its osmolality will fall, become in fact lesser than plasma. Okay, and this is why this segment is called as diluting segment. All right. Now the NaCl, which is absorbed in this segment, it raises, which is reabsorbed in this segment, it raises the osmolality of outer medullary interstitium by 200 milliosmoles. Okay, so now here the interstitial fluid, its osmolality gets raised by 200 milliosmoles. Okay, and this separation of solute and water, okay, by the thick ascending limb leads to this difference of osmolality between the tubular fluid and the interstitial fluid. And this is called as your single effect. And as I said, this is the main force which is driving your counter current multiplier. Okay, I hope that's clear. Now let's move on to the single effect in inner medulla. So the origin of single effect in case of medullary gradient, it occurs due to three different mechanisms. So one is passive transport of sodium from your ascending thin limb into the interstitium. Second is active transport of sodium. Okay, this is from the inner medullary collecting duct. And then thirdly is diffusion of urea from collecting duct into the medullary interstitium. And when does this happen? The third mechanism, the diffusion of urea, happens when ADH concentration is increased in blood. So let's go on to them one by one. So now your inner medulla, it contains the ascending thin limb of the loop of Henle of juxtamedullary nephrons, right? And we know that that is impermeable to water and cannot actively absorb solutes, right? Now the single effect is therefore produced by passive diffusion of solutes, okay, which occurs because of difference in composition of tubular fluid and that of the interstitium. So firstly, you will have some passive diffusion of solutes. Okay. And the tubular fluid in the ascending thin limb is relatively, see here, the ascending thin limb. So the tubular fluid in the ascending thin limb is relatively rich in sodium chloride, but it has less urea in it compared to the interstitium. Okay. So consequently, what will happen? The sodium chloride moves out from the ATS, okay, into the interstitium, and urea moves into the ATS from the interstitium. Okay, why did this happen? Because the tubular fluid in your ascending thin limb was rich in sodium chloride but had less urea. So now urea has moved in from the interstitium into the tubular fluid. But the rate at which sodium chloride diffuses out and at which urea diffuses into the lumen, so the rate of sodium chloride diffusion is much higher than that of urea diffusion out. Okay. Sorry, the rate of sodium chloride diffusing out is more than urea diffusing into the lumen, and as a result, more solute diffuses out in the interstitium, raising the inner medullary osmolality. Okay. So what has happened? Sodium chloride diffused out, urea diffused in, but the rate of sodium chloride diffusing out was far more than urea diffusing in. So now here in your interstitium, the inner medullary osmolality has increased. Okay, so this is your first mechanism. Now going on to second mechanism. So you might remember this diagram from the last lecture where I was telling you about sodium reabsorption in distal tubules and collecting ducts, how that happens. So it's on the same lines. So what happens here? Now, in addition to the passive diffusion of sodium in ascending segment, which we just talked about, smaller quantities of ions are also transported from the medullary part of the collecting duct into the medullary interstitium, particularly in the inner part of medulla near the sinus. Okay. So what happens in the principal cells? Okay, see here, this is the principal cell of the collecting duct. So two things happen, which we have already read about when we talked about the sodium handling by the collecting duct. So we already know that here sodium reabsorption occurs actively by the sodium potassium ATPase across the basolateral membrane, right? And then we had read earlier on itself that this is followed by electrogenic passive chloride reabsorption paracellularly, okay, driven by lumen negative charge generated by diffusional influx of sodium. So here you see there is sodium diffusion happening inside the cell. Yes, and I had explained this last time. So here your tubular fluid, when lots of sodium is diffusing inside, here there is a negative charge which is generated in the tubular fluid here. Okay, and now that negative charge will drive the chloride ions to be reabsorbed passively paracellularly. Okay, and this we already know that sodium was getting reabsorbed actively by the sodium potassium ATPase across the basolateral membrane. So this is the second mechanism. Third is that of the urea. So urea plays an important role in development of medullary osmotic gradient, especially when concentration of ADH is high in the blood. And under such circumstances, your IMCD absorbs large amount of urea, employing a specialized urea transport protein, UTA. I had mentioned this also last time when we talked about the renal handling of urea. And apart from this, there occurs urea recycling, which also I had mentioned last time. Okay, so both these things play an important role in the counter current system. Okay, I had gone through this table earlier also, that there is tubular secretion of urea, then there is concentration of urea in the CCD and OMCD, then reabsorption of urea in the IMCD, then diffusion of urea in the medullary interstitium, then absorption of urea in vasa recta, then diffusion of urea in the cortical interstitium, and back to tubular secretion. So this urea recycling keeps on occurring. Okay, so we've now understood, or hopefully, about how the single effect occurs. Now, what happens in the multiplication of this single effect? Okay, so the hyperosmolality and medullary gradient is in fact generated by multiplication of single effect by counter current multiplier. Okay, and the main components of the multiplier which play role in multiplication of the single effect are: one is the high permeability of descending thin limb to water. Secondly, the impermeability to water but high permeability to sodium chloride of thin ascending limb. Right? We just talked about that we know that the thin ascending limb is impermeable to water, but at the same time, it is highly permeable to sodium chloride. Then impermeability of water and ability to actively transport solutes by thick ascending limb again, right? And finally, in the renal medulla, all other tubular structures except ascending limb are in osmotic equilibrium. Okay, so the descending limb acquires the increased osmolality of the surrounding fluid. The effect is multiplied in many times as the new isoosmolar filtrate arrives at the descending limb and forces the concentrated tubular contents towards the loop of Henle. Okay, so it's basically your descending limb which acquires the increased osmolality of surrounding fluid, and so this effect, the single effect, is multiplied many times as the new isoosmolar filtrate arrives at the descending limb and forces the tubular contents towards the tip of loop of Henle or the hairpin band. Okay, the same thing is mentioned here. Okay, how the transport happens in various segments of the nephron. Now, what are the steps of the multiplication of single effect? So, a way to understand the process of multiplication of single effect is, a hypothetical situation leading to normal equilibrium condition. Okay, so for that purpose, initially, let us assume that the osmolality of fluid in the descending limb. Now, see, in each of these diagrams, I'm talking about diagram, the A part right now. So we assume that the osmolality of fluid in the descending limb, okay, of the loop of Henle and medullary interstitium is 300 milliosmoles per kg of water. Okay. Now let's assume that the thick ascending limb, okay, this would be a thick ascending limb. Let's assume that the thick ascending limb actively pumps out 100 milliosmoles of water of sodium chloride into the interstitium. Okay, so now the thick ascending limb has pumped out 100 milliosmoles per kg of water of sodium chloride into the interstitium. Okay, now since we know that this thick ascending limb is impermeable to water, so what will be the effect of this pumping out of sodium chloride? The effect will be to lower the osmolality of fluid in the thick ascending limb to 200 milliosmoles per kg water. Okay, so here you can see in B that the osmolality of fluid in the thick ascending limb has gone down to 200 milliosmoles per kg of water, and in turn what happened in your interstitium, the osmolality increased to 400 milliosmoles per kg of water. Okay, so this establishment of the osmotic gradient of 200 milliosmoles per kg water, as we talked about earlier also, this is your single effect that we spoke about. Okay, I hope there is more clarity regarding this concept now. Okay, and the portion of descending thin limb, okay, which is located in the outer medulla, it is moderately permeable to sodium and highly permeable to water. Remember that. Okay, so now let's go on to the next diagram. Now, because of this osmotic gradient which got created here, now the water moves out, okay, and the sodium from the interstitium moves into the descending thin limb. Okay, so here see, first it was 400 milliosmoles. Now what is happening is the water has moved out from the descending thin limb, and the sodium from the interstitium, which was earlier 400, moves into the descending thin limb. Okay, and again changing the osmolality till the equilibrium is reached with osmolality of 350 milliosmoles per kg water. Okay, so now this was 300. Okay, this was 400. The water moved out, the sodium moved in, and now they have achieved a new equilibrium with 350 milliosmoles in both. Okay. Now the fresh isoosmolar filtrate at 300 osmoles per kg water trickles down into the. So now your new isoosmolar filtrate will keep coming, no, into the descending thin limb, trickles down into the descending loop, and it pushes some of the hyperosmolar fluid, which was 350 at 350 milliosmoles per water, into the ascending limb here. See, so this was all 200 here, but now your new isoosmolar fluid has trickled down from the top into the descending thin limb. It is pushing this the already present fluid in descending thin limb at 350 milliosmoles per liter. It is pushing it towards the it is pushing the hyperosmolar fluid into the ascending limb. So here also now this fluid has reached the ascending thin limb. Okay, compare it with this one. See the difference. And now in the meantime, what is happening? Your hypotonic fluid, okay, it is flowing into the distal tubule, and isotonic and subsequently hypertonic fluid flows into the ascending thin limb. And as the process with all these steps keeps repeating, okay, this process will keep repeating. Okay, and the final result is what? A gradient of osmolality from top to bottom of the loop and the surrounding interstitium. So see, look at E and F, what is happening? Okay, hypotonic fluid is flowing from the distal tubule, and isotonic and subsequently this hypertonic fluid it's flowing to the ascending limb. Okay, and because of this repetition of process, what is happening? What is the end result? The gradient of osmolality builds up from the top to the bottom of the loop and the surrounding interstitium. So I hope you all got some understanding of the counter current multiplier, how that single effect first was generated and later multiplied. Okay, so now let's go on to the counter current exchanger. Okay, so your vasa recta is the counter current exchanger. Now again, if the vasa recta would have been a straight vessel, as you see here, what would have happened then? The osmotic gradient in the medullary interstitium, it wouldn't have lasted long. Why? Because the sodium and urea in the interstitial spaces, okay, they would have simply gotten removed through circulation. Okay, if this was like a straight pipe, then we wouldn't have been able to maintain this osmolality gradient which was created for this specific purpose. But because in actuality, as you see in B, what we have is a hairpin or a U-shaped anatomical arrangement of the vasa recta. It operates as a counter current exchanger and it retains these fluids in the interstitium. Okay, because of a constant to and fro of these solutes, okay, between the tubular fluid and the circulation. So what happens is ultimately it ends up retaining these solutes in the interstitium, which it otherwise would have lost to circulation had it been a straight tube. So the counter current exchanger formed by the vasa recta is responsible, as I said earlier, for the maintenance of the hyperosmolality medullary gradient, which was generated by the counter current multiplier. Okay. Now, how does the counter current multiplier operate? Okay, so the operation of the counter current multiplier basically occurs at different levels. Okay, and we know about the vasa recta that it is a capillary network supplying blood to the medulla, right? And we know it is highly permeable to solute and water. So in addition to bringing nutrients and oxygen to tubules within the medulla, these capillaries, more importantly, they remove the excess water and solutes, which are continuously added to the interstitium by the nephron segments in this region. Now, what happens at the level of descending vasa recta? Okay. So it's the same diagram that we saw just now. So just have a look. When the descending vasa recta dips down in the medulla, having a progressively increasing osmolality, see from 300 to 1200 milliosmoles per kg water, the solutes, they diffuse into the lumen. Okay, and water diffuses out so that the blood flowing in it with osmolality 300 milliosmoles per kg water equilibrates with the medullary interstitium. Okay, so what is happening? Solutes are diffusing into the lumen, water is flowing out. Okay, and so osmolality is increasing progressively, as you see. Okay, now what happens at the level of ascending vasa recta? Okay, now the vasa recta loops around, okay, and ascends towards the cortex. Once again, what happened here that we just mentioned? That see, water was diffusing out and solutes were diffusing in, right? And so the osmolality kept increasing. Now, when the vasa recta loops around and ascends towards the cortex, at the beginning of the ascending vasa recta, the blood has attained an osmolality of 1200 milliosmoles per kg water. Then it passes through the interstitium where the osmolality is decreasing from 1200 milliosmoles to 300. Okay, so what happens here now? The solutes move out and water diffuses in. See, the opposite basically happens. And so the blood in it, again, it equilibrates with the interstitium. See, it started also as equilibrating with the interstitium, isn't it? It's the same osmolality. Then the water flowed out, solutes came in, osmolality kept increasing in the descending vasa recta. Then as the vasa recta ascended upwards, what happened? The opposite took place. The water diffused back in, solutes went back in, and again it is equilibrated with the interstitium. All right. So by all these processes, what happens actually? The solutes, they tend to recirculate in the medulla. Okay. And the water tends to bypass it so that the hypertonicity of the medulla is maintained. Okay, and because the solutes, essentially we are talking about, when we are saying solutes, we are mainly referring to sodium and urea. They are exchanged for water between the ascending and descending limbs of the vasa recta. Okay, they are getting exchanged here. So that's why the system is called as counter current exchanger. Okay. Now, another factor which ensures retention of sodium in the medullary interstitium is very slow rate of blood flow through the medullary parenchyma. Okay, and there are some important facts about this very slow blood flow. One is the ability of the vasa recta to maintain the medullary interstitial gradient, which is based on the flow. So a substantial increase in blood flow through vasa recta will dissipate. So both situations will disturb this process. Okay, if there is a substantial increase in blood flow through the vasa recta, it will dissipate this medullary gradient. Okay, it will wash it out. And if alternatively, if blood flow is reduced, the nephron segments within the medulla will receive inadequate oxygen. And what will happen because of that? Especially the ones involved in tubular transport, like the thick ascending limb. So their oxygenation will get impaired. So again, the medullary interstitial osmotic gradient cannot be maintained. Okay. Also, one more thing to remember is this counter current exchanger. It is a passive process. Okay, because it depends on the diffusion of water and solutes in both directions across the permeable walls of vasa recta, as we just saw, isn't it? It's moving, the solutes and water are moving in both directions. So it cannot maintain the osmotic gradient along medullary pyramids if the process of counter current multiplier was to stop for some reason. Okay, so because your exchanger is a passive process, if for some reason your multiplier, the process of the multiplier stopped, your exchanger will not be able to on its own maintain the osmotic gradient. Now, what we talked about earlier, the mechanism, or rather we referred to it, the mechanism of producing urine by the kidney based on needs, whether it produces dilute or concentrated urine. Okay, now let's talk about production of dilute urine. So what are the conditions in which dilute urine is formed? Now dilute urine is called hypoosmotic urine. What does that mean? In which urine osmolality is less than the blood osmolality. And in which circumstances is it formed? One is when your circulating levels of ADH are low. When can that happen? For example, after drinking water or in a central diabetes insipidus. Okay. Secondly, when is the dilute urine formed? When ADH is ineffective. For example, in a condition of nephrogenic diabetes insipidus. Okay. Now, what are the principal factors which govern the formation of dilute urine? Okay. So as I mentioned right in the beginning, the principal factors governing formation of dilute and concentrated urine were, what were they? Hyperosmolality, medullary gradient, and the presence of the antidiuretic hormone, right? ADH. This was the first slide that we talked about. And second is the renal medullary osmotic gradient. Okay, that is less in absence of ADH. Why? Because ADH stimulates both the counter current multiplication and your urea recycling. So remember that for these for the osmotic gradient to occur, okay, we need ADH. It is stimulating both your counter current multiplier and your urea recycling, okay, which were important for the single effect in inner medulla, which we just talked about. Now let's go on to production of concentrated urine. Okay. So concentrated urine is also called as hyperosmotic urine. And what does that mean? That the urine osmolality is more than that of blood. This is produced when circulating ADH levels are high. Okay. And what are those conditions? For example, in water deprivation, in hemorrhage, and in syndrome of inappropriate antidiuretic hormone, SIADH. Okay, I think you will, again in endocrinology, you might learn a bit more about this syndrome. And what are the principal factors governing the formation of concentrated urine? So the high level of ADH is the main factor governing the formation of concentrated urine. Because why so? Because one, it increases the size of the hyperosmolality, medullary gradient, as we just spoke. It augments the urea cycling from the inner medullary conducting ducts into the medullary interstitial fluid. This also we went through just now. So basically, what does ADH do? It stimulates sodium chloride reabsorption in the thick ascending limb, and so it increases the size of the medullary gradient by the counter current multiplier. Okay, so क्या किया ADH ने? इसने NaCl की reabsorption thick ascending limb में बढ़ा दी, stimulate कर दी, जिससे medullary gradient हमारा बढ़ गया, multiply हो गया. Secondly, ADH ने क्या किया? It increases the water permeability of principal cells of late distal tubule and collecting duct. Okay, we saw this diagram earlier, right? When we just saw it in the principal cells, what happens? So there, ADH, it increased the water permeability of principal cells in both your distal tubule and collecting duct through aquaporins too. Okay. Now, just a word before we go on about how it does so. Okay. So your ADH exerts its antidiuretic effect by binding to specific plasma membrane receptor called as V2 receptor on the capillary or the basal side of the cell, where it activates adenyl cyclase. Okay, so now this increase in intracellular CAMP, it activates protein kinase on opposite luminal or the apical side of the cell. The activated protein kinase leads to rapid insertion of protein water channels called as aquaporins in plasma membranes of principal cells of collecting duct. Now, through these protein water channels or the aquaporins, the water rapidly moves from tubular lumen into the collecting duct cells. Okay, again, this is mentioned in your endocrinology when you are reading about ADH as a hormone itself. Okay, this is the mechanism. And just for your information, aquaporins are of different types. 1, 2, and 3 are found in kidney. 4 is found in brain. 5 is found in salivary and lacrimal and respiratory, lacrimal glands and respiratory tract. Aquaporins as such is an important term, one you can get as a short note or even be asked about in the Viva. So the important thing to note is that the tubular response to ADH is not an all or none phenomena, but a graded response. Okay, so varying grades of plasma ADH concentrations can produce proportionate increase in permeability of collecting ducts to water. So consequently, depending on the status of body water and plasma osmolality, considerable variations in rate of urine flow and urine osmolality normally occur in different parts of the day. For example, after an overnight fast, the morning urine samples, they tend to be relatively more concentrated. Okay, so let's go on to the next topic here, which is urine volume and the change in osmolality in response to water intake and even deprivation. What happens in that case? So, what is water diuresis? It refers to an increased urinary output following excessive intake of water or hypotonic solution. Why does it occur? It occurs due to absence of ADH in plasma. Okay, and these are the steps involved. Just have a look. So when the water intake is increased, there is decrease in plasma osmolality. That leads to inhibition of osmoreceptors in anterior hypothalamus. Okay, because of that, there is decreased ADH secretion from posterior pituitary. So there is decreased water permeability of DCT and collecting duct. There is decreased water reabsorption, and so now your your urine osmolality and urine volume will go up. So you see, there is sort of a proportionate increase in your urine volume and osmolality as per your water intake, increased water intake. Okay. So due to absence of ADH, the distal tubules and collecting ducts, they become impermeable to water, leading to marked decrease in resorption. Okay. However, the water resorption in PCT and loop of Henle is not affected. So basically, this mechanism is basically taking place in distal tubule and collecting duct. As I told you that ADH, the main role is in principal cells of collecting ducts and distal tubules. Okay, so the proximal tubule and loop of Henle is not affected. Okay, so what are the features of water diuresis? It begins about 15 minutes after ingestion of water, reaches its maximum in 40 minutes. The urine output may be increased to 20 liters per day. The urine formed is dilute. Osmolality is always below 30 milliosmoles per kg water and may be as low as 50 milliosmoles per kg water. The specific gravity of urine is always below 1.010. Okay, I hope the concept of water diuresis is clear. Now let's go on to water deprivation. So water deprivation is followed by a sequence of changes which consume water for the body needs. Because of that, the urine volume is decreased, but the urine osmolality is increased. Okay, so just have a look what happens in water deprivation. So your plasma osmolality will increase. Okay, that will stimulate the osmoreceptors in anterior hypothalamus. They will cause release of ADH from the posterior pituitary. Now, as we just saw, that ADH affects the principal cells of distal tubule and collecting duct. So it will increase the water permeability in these parts of the nephron. Your water reabsorption will go up and your urine osmolality will go up. But your urine volume will go down, right? So again, if you have taken less water, then it's expected that the urine volume will also be less. So again, a proportionate decrease, so to say, has happened in this case, and it's mainly dependent on ADH. Okay. Now, just a word about water intoxication. So this occurs because of ADH secretion. Okay, that leads to water retention or what we call as water intoxication. So during water diuresis, maximum urine flow that can be produced is 16 milliliter per minute. Now, if the water ingestion exceeds this limit of water excretion, there occurs water stasis, which leads to marked increase in extracellular fluid. Similar situation may also occur when water intake is not reduced after administration of exogenous vasopressin or secretion of endogenous vasopressin in response to non-osmotic stimuli, such as in case of a surgical trauma. So consequently, the body cells are swollen because of uptake of water by cells, okay, which increases the hypotonicity of extracellular fluid. And symptoms of water intoxication occur rarely, when swelling of brain cells may actually cause convulsions, coma, and eventually death. So I think these conditions again are mentioned in your endocrinology. You can go through them in detail then. Okay, so coming to osmotic diuresis. Osmotic diuresis refers to an increased urine output because of an osmotic effect. Okay, and what is the pathophysiology? Basically, presence of large quantities of unreabsorbed solutes in the PCT. it exerts an appreciable osmotic effect. Okay, and this table gives you the differences between the water diuresis and osmotic diuresis, and it's a very useful table. It tells you about the characteristics of urine in both the cases, the pathophysiology in cases of both, okay, and how the water absorption differs in the different segments. So in case of water diuresis, the volume of urine is 20 liters per day. Actually, in both, it's more than 20 liters per day. Osmolality is different. In water diuresis, we said that up to 5 milliosmoles per kg water, but in osmotic diuresis, more than 300 osmoles per kg water. Specific gravity is always less than 1.010, always more than 1.010. As we just read, pathophysiology for water diuresis was due to absence or reduced secretion of ADH, and which happens in which conditions? Diabetes insipidus or excessive water drinking. But what are the causes of osmotic diuresis? Because of, as I just said, large quantity of unabsorbed solutes which exert a osmotic effect. And in what conditions does that happen? When there's an increased filtered load of sodium or glucose, such as in diabetes mellitus or urea, and that exceeds your tubular maximum, the TM. Then mannitol or other polysaccharide administration, substances filtered but not absorbed by tubules, and excessive sodium chloride administration. Now, how does the water absorption differ? So we just talked about water diuresis, that in PCT and loop of Henle, the process is normal. Where the difference comes in is DCT and collecting tubules, right? Where it is the water absorption is decreased because of lack of ADH, right? But in case of osmotic diuresis, it's in the PCT that water absorption is reduced, and the loop of Henle again where it is reduced, okay? Because concentration gradient is not set up due to decreased absorption in PCT. And in fact, decreased also in DCT and collecting ducts due to increased load, even if the ADH secretion is normal. So here it's basically water absorption is reduced in all three major segments. Now, assessment of renal dilution and concentrating ability. So this assessment, okay, of whether, how are the abilities of the kidney functioning in terms of diluting or concentrating urine as per need of the body. This can be done by these tests, such as a urine concentration test, a measurement of urine specific gravity, a measurement of urine osmolality, estimation of free water clearance, or even a urine dilution test. So we will talk about these when we talk about the kidney function tests in detail. Okay, so right now we'll not get into this. Now let's come to acidification of urine. So now the pH of urine is variable, right? We know that, and that depends on concentration of hydrogen ions. Now, under normal circumstances, the pH of urine is acidic, right? This basically means that the kidneys have contributed to the acidification of urine when it is formed from plasma, which is itself 7.4, right? So how has the pH come down? Because of the kidney's ability to acidify the urine. So what does that mean? That hydrogen ions generated in the body in normal circumstances are eliminated by the acidified urine. Okay, so it is here that the role of kidneys comes in for maintenance of acid-base balance of the body, and that is a very, very important role, as we had spoken even in the functions of kidney in the first lecture itself. Now, the kidneys regulate the blood pH by three main mechanisms. What are they? Reabsorption of the filtered bicarbonate, then generation of sodium bicarbonate of the alkali reserve of the body, and thirdly, excretion of acid in form of titrable acid and ammonia ions. Okay, And all these mechanisms are accomplished through process of hydrogen secretion by the nephron. Okay, so let's learn more about that now. How does the hydrogen ion secretion occur? So now your tubular cells of PCT, DT, and collecting tubule, okay, they all are capable of secreting hydrogen ion. Okay, what is the mechanism? Now let's learn about the mechanism in the following steps. Okay, so first step is formation of carbonic acid, okay, or your H2CO3, first formed in the cells of PCT, and this occurs, see here, this occurs from carbon dioxide and water, okay, by a reaction that is catalyzed by intracellular carbonic anhydrase, okay. So this leads to formation of, this is your first step, carbonic acid. Just try to recall that we had touched upon hydrogen ion secretion in the last lecture also, so this will help reinforce that again. Okay, now then what is the, so this is happening by your intracellular carbonic anhydrase. So in case carbonic anhydrase inhibitors are taken, then they depress the secretion of acid by the PCT. Okay, so we have carbonic anhydrase inhibitors which can counteract here. What is the second step? So now the second step is the dissociation of carbonic acid into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ion. This is your second step. What is your third step? Now secretion of hydrogen ions into the lumen. Okay, hydrogen ions are going into the lumen, and this is occurring via the sodium hydrogen exchange mechanism, which is here on your luminal or the apical membrane. Okay, and what happens is, so basically this is an example of the secondary active transport, in which first your sodium is extruded actively from the cell here into the interstitium by sodium potassium ATPase. Okay? And when it is exuded out into the interstitial fluid, your intracellular sodium is lowered, right? Now when the intracellular sodium is lowered, then this is followed by entry of sodium into the cell from the lumen, coupled with hydrogen secretion into the lumen by the sodium hydrogen antiporter. So I hope this is clear. First, what happened? The sodium was exuded out into the interstitial fluid by means of the sodium potassium ATPase. The intracellular sodium became less, right? And so this is followed by sodium entry into the cell, okay, from the lumen, which is coupled with hydrogen secretion out back in the lumen by the sodium hydrogen antiporter. This is your step 3. Now step 4. Now this secreted hydrogen, okay, in the lumen, it combines with the filtered bicarbonate and helps its reabsorption. Okay, so that fourth step will happen here in the lumen, where the secreted hydrogen will combine with the filtered bicarbonate and helps in its reabsorption. So this process doesn't result in net secretion of hydrogen ions. Okay, and then now the bicarbonate formed in the cell, this one, because of dissociation of carbonic acid, it diffuses into the interstitial fluid. So for each hydrogen ion that is secreted, one sodium ion and one bicarbonate ion is one sodium ion and one bicarbonate ion ends up entering the interstitial fluid. Okay, So for each hydrogen ion secreted, you have a sodium entering the interstitial fluid and you have a bicarb ion entering the interstitial fluid. Adding these both are adding to the alkali reserve of the body. Okay, so I hope this is clear of the hydrogen secretion occurring in the PCT. Now, how does the same happen in your distal tubule and collecting duct? Here, the hydrogen secretion occurs independent of sodium. Okay, and there are two mechanisms which are involved in this. So, this is done by the intercalated cells. Okay, remember we learnt about ADH effect in the principal cells of distal tubule and collecting duct. Now, H secretion is happening by the intercalated cells of the same distal tubule and collecting duct. What are these two mechanisms? One is a ATP driven proton pump, which is mainly responsible for secretion of hydrogen in the DCT and collecting duct. And then you also have a hydrogen potassium ATPase responsible for secretion of some of the hydrogen coupled with reabsorption of potassium in these parts in the renal tubule. Okay. Now, just to understand that what is the fate of hydrogen in the renal tubule. Okay. So now secretion of hydrogen in renal tubule can continue only if the hydrogen is immediately buffered in the luminal fluid. Okay. So the tubular cells can secrete hydrogen due to the luminal fluid pH of 4.5. That means a hydrogen concentration of urine that is 1,000 times the concentration in plasma. In the absence of buffering hydrogen in the lumen, the pH would be reached rapidly, stopping further hydrogen secretion. The pH 4.5 is thus the limiting pH. However, free hydrogen secretion in the renal tubules is immediately buffered, okay, which permits more acid to be secreted. So what happens in the PCT? In the PCT, the secreted hydrogen is buffered by filtered bicarbonate, okay, as we just spoke about. Okay, that means which is consumed in reabsorption of filtered bicarbonate. And in the distal tubule and collecting ducts, the secreted hydrogen ions are buffered by sodium phosphate and ammonium and are excreted as titrable acid and ammonium ion. Okay, so in PCT, we just read that it is buffered by filtered bicarbonate, right? Didn't we see that just now, that here this secreted hydrogen ion is going to be buffered by the filtered bicarbonate here in the lumen. But in the collecting duct and in the distal tubule, these secreted hydrogen ions are buffered by sodium phosphate and ammonia and are excreted as titrable acid and ammonium ion. So now a word about reabsorption of bicarbonate. So the concentration of bicarbonate in plasma and consequently in glomerular filtrate is 24 milliequivalent per liter. So the glomerular filtration delivers about 4320 milliequivalents of bicarbonate per day to the nephron. Now, the reabsorption of filtered bicarbonate is critically important for prevention of its loss in urine and for maintenance of the acid-base balance in body. Okay, so now under normal circumstances, virtually all filtered bicarbonate is reabsorbed by different segments of the nephron, and normally none appears in the urine. So that is the importance of reabsorption of filtered bicarbonate. See, you can see in this diagram, okay, the reabsorption is happening all through the proximal tubule, then ascending limb, and here itself, and in different proportions. so that ultimately, see, there is no bicarbonate loss in urine. None of it is supposed to appear in urine under normal circumstances. Now, what are the mechanisms of reabsorption of the filtered bicarbonate? Okay, so we just talked about how the hydrogen secreted in proximal tubular lumen is combined with filtered bicarbonate to form carbonic acid, right? And then it was converted to carbon dioxide and water, right? We saw this here. Yes. So this reaction was catalyzed by brush border carbonic anhydrase. Okay, and the carbon dioxide diffuses into the tubular cell along the concentration gradient. In the tubular cell, carbon dioxide again combines with hydrogen to form carbonic acid. Okay, and then we saw this step where again carbonic acid dissociates into hydrogen and bicarb ions, followed by hydrogen secretion in tubule and diffusion of bicarb into the interstitial spaces, right? And we found that for each mole of bicarbonate reabsorbed from the lumen, 1 mole of bicarbonate diffuses from the cell into the blood. So each bicarb which will be reabsorbed through the lumen, okay, 1 mole of bicarbonate will be diffused from tubular cell into the blood, even though it's not the same mole that disappeared from the tubular fluid. I told you this in last lecture also, that the filtered bicarbonate which comes in and the bicarbonate which diffuses out to the interstitial fluid is not the same one. Okay, that is a new bicarbonate ion. Okay, it's a different one. So don't confuse that as being as the same one. Okay, and the important thing is that net reabsorption of filtered bicarbonate process, it neutralizes the hydrogen secreted into the lumen, okay, which means that there is no net secretion of hydrogen in the lumen, and consequently the pH of fluid of the tubule is changed very little. Okay, so there's no net secretion because whatever hydrogen ion will get secreted will be combining with the filtered bicarbonate. Okay, and that process will neutralize the hydrogen ion secretion. So there's no net hydrogen ion secretion, and the pH of the tubular fluid is not altered much. Okay, so this was again a reinforcement of how the proximal tubule reabsorbs approximately 80% of your filtered bicarbonate. Okay, now what happens in the loop of Henle? I just showed you here. So this is what we were just talking about, right? Reabsorbing 80% of filtered bicarb. In case of loop of Henle, it is doing so. It is reabsorbing 15% of the filtered bicarbonate, and mainly in the region of here, thick ascending limb. And the mechanism involved is exactly the same as we talked about in the proximal tubule, except that the brush border carbonic anhydrase is not present in the apical membrane of thick ascending limb. Okay, that's the only difference. What happens in case of the distal tubule and collecting duct, they reabsorb only 5% of filtered bicarbonate, which escapes absorption in the proximal tubule, and whatever has escaped these two areas now will be reabsorbed in the distal tubule and collecting duct. So some of the hydrogen secreted by intercalated cells of these parts of the tubule is utilized in the reabsorption of bicarbonate ion. Okay, while most of the hydrogen secreted in these segments is excreted with non-bicarbonate urinary buffers. So this is telling you that some of the hydrogen secretion in the which we just read about in the intercalated cells of these parts, some of it is reabsorbed for some of it is utilized for reabsorption of bicarbonate ion, and most of that hydrogen ion in these segments is excreted with non-bicarb urinary buffers. Okay, so now regulation of the bicarbonate secretion. So now there are various factors that regulate bicarbonate secretion. For example, bicarbonate reabsorption or the hydrogen secretion. And we can learn about them as two groups: primary factors and secondary factors. Primary factors are those directed at maintaining acid-base balance involved in regulation of these two ions. So the first factor is plasma bicarbonate level. Okay, that is controlling the amount of bicarb reabsorption. So if there's increase in plasma bicarbonate, it increases the filtered load of bicarbonate, resulting in increased reabsorption. However, if the reverse happens, plasma concentration becomes very high, the filtered load will exceed resorptive capacity, and the bicarbonate ions will appear in urine, and urine becomes alkaline. Conversely, with decrease in plasma bicarbonate, filtered load is decreased, and this will result in decreased bicarb secretion. So under these circumstances, more hydrogen becomes available to combine with other buffer anions, and therefore lower the plasma bicarbonate concentration, more acidic the urine becomes, and greater is the ammonium content. Okay. The second primary factor is PCO2 level. If that increases, it results in increased rate of bicarbonate reabsorption as the supply of intracellular hydrogen for secretion is increased, and the reverse happens when the PCO2 level is decreased. These effects of changes in PCO2 are the physiological basis for renal compensation for respiratory acidosis and alkalosis. So something I think we'll come across again when we study about the acid-base function of the kidney in detail. Now, what are the secondary factors? So these are not directed at maintaining acid-base balance. They are involved in the regulation of bicarbonate reabsorption. They are, one is the ECF volume. So ECF volume expansion, which means that positive sodium balance secondarily results in less hydrogen secretion through the sodium hydrogen antiport and decreased bicarb reabsorption. Conversely, if there is ECF volume contraction, which means negative sodium balance, that results in increased hydrogen secretion through sodium hydrogen antiport and increased bicarb reabsorption. The aldosterone and angiotensin II are involved in changes in sodium-linked hydrogen secretion, with changes in ECF volume. Then second factor is changes in aldosterone and angiotensin II secondarily affect the bicarb reabsorption by the effect on sodium reabsorption and associated hydrogen secretion through sodium hydrogen antiporter. Third is your parathyroid hormone, which also inhibits bicarb reabsorption by proximal tubules. It's mainly involved in maintenance of calcium and phosphate balance. Again, something you will read in endo. However, the parathyroid hormone also inhibits sodium hydrogen antiporter in the apical membrane of PCT cells. And lastly, your plasma potassium levels also influence the secretion of hydrogen by proximal tubules, with hypokalemia stimulating and hyperkalemia inhibiting secretion. Now, a word about generation of new bicarb ion. So, as we know, the kidneys play an important role in maintaining acid-base balance of the body by completely reabsorbing the filtered bicarbonate. But in reality, the bicarbonate reabsorption alone does not replenish the bicarbonate lost during the titration of non-volatile acids which are daily added to the plasma from diet and produced by metabolism. Okay. So to maintain acid-base balance, the kidneys replace this lost bicarbonate with new bicarbonate. Okay, I told you that there is constant use of filtered bicarbonate and there is constant production of new bicarbonate. Okay, and how does the kidney do this? By the processes such as excretion of hydrogen as titrable acid and excretion of hydrogen as ammonium. Okay, so now a word about excretion of hydrogen as titrable acid. So this refers to the excretion of hydrogen ions along with the primary urinary buffer, that is dibasic phosphate, okay, HPO4. This reaction occurs in the DT and distal tubules and collecting ducts because it is here that the phosphate which escapes proximal reabsorption is greatly concentrated by reabsorption of water. So one method of excretion of hydrogen is by converting it into a titrable acid, okay, and that mainly occurs in the distal tubules and collecting ducts. Why? Because it is here that phosphate which has escaped the proximal reabsorption is greatly concentrated here by reabsorption of water. So you have that available to combine with the hydrogen ions to form ammonium. Now, little bit about what is the mechanism of this process. Okay. So basically your hydrogen and bicarbonate which are produced in the cell, okay, from the CO2 and H2O. Now the new bicarbonate is reabsorbed into the blood, okay. The hydrogen is secreted into the lumen, okay, mainly by a hydrogen ATPase. And this now combines with filtered HPO4, okay, to form hydrogen phosphate acid, which is a titrable acid. Okay. What happened again? Let's go through this again. So your hydrogen and bicarbonate, which were produced inside the cell, okay, from the CO2 and water, okay. So the new bicarbonate was reabsorbed into the blood, right? And the hydrogen which was secreted into the lumen, okay. See, earlier in the PCT, we were talking about this combining with filtered bicarbonate. But in this part of the nephron now, okay, we are talking about in the DT and the CT, where there is plenty of concentrated phosphate, okay, because of reabsorption of water. Now this hydrogen which goes into the lumen, okay, this will be now combining with phosphate ions, okay, and on combining it forms hydrogen phosphoric acid basically, which is a titrable acid, okay. So as a result of the hydrogen excretion in form of a titrable acid, the pH of the urine, okay, is progressively decreased from 7.4, that of blood, to 4.5, okay. This acidification of urine may lower its pH to a minimum, which is 4.5. Now, H concentration of urine is approximately 1,000 times that of the plasma, as I mentioned a while back. So, the titrable acidity is a measure of acid excreted in the urine by kidney. So, this process here and earlier with filtered bicarbonate, this is what is telling you of how the kidney actually acidifies the urine. Okay, and how, when the urine finally comes out, its hydrogen ion concentration is nearly 10,000 times that of the plasma. Okay, and the pH is reduced from a 7.4 of blood to a 4.5 of urine. Okay, so basically, just by correlating these things, if you are able to measure, if you are able to understand how much titrable acid is being formed, then that titrable acidity will give you a measure of the acidifying property of the kidney. Now, the excretion of hydrogen as ammonium ion, it occurs in 4 stages. Okay, excretion of hydrogen as ammonium is basically another mechanism of excretion of hydrogen ion and formation of new bicarbonate. But the important thing is that the new bicarbonate formation by this process depends on the kidney's ability to excrete ammonium in the urine. If ammonium is not excreted in urine, but instead enters the systemic circulation, it will titrate plasma bicarbonate, thus negating the process of generating new bicarbonate. The amount of hydrogen excreted as ammonium depends upon the amount of ammonia secreted by renal cells and the urine pH. The process by which kidneys excrete ammonium is complex and basically can be understood in these 4 stages. So first is synthesis of ammonium and new bicarbon, PCT. Second is reabsorption of ammonium across thick ascending limb. Third is accumulation of ammonium in medullary interstitium. And fourth is anionic diffusion and diffusion trapping in collecting ducts. So let's look at stage 1. Stage 1 is ammonium is produced in the cells of proximal tubules from the metabolism of glutamine. So just see here. Each molecule of glutamine is metabolized into 2 molecules, each of ammonium and bicarbonate. Okay, ammonium and bicarbonate. So now this bicarbonate, it diffuses across the basolateral membrane into the peritubular blood as new bicarbonate ion. Okay, and the ammonium, okay, is secreted into the lumen. Just see that they've just noticed they've reversed the sides of the earlier diagrams. You had the tubular fluid on the left, the blood on the right. They have reversed it, so don't get confused by that. It's the same process. And ammonium is secreted into the lumen, okay, via the sodium hydrogen antiporter, okay, with ammonium substituting for hydrogen. Some ammonium is converted into ammonia and hydrogen. Okay. So some is converted into ammonia. Okay. And some is secreted into the lumen via a sodium hydrogen antiporter. Okay. And the ammonia which diffuses into the lumen, okay, where it combines with secreted hydrogen to form again ammonium. Okay, so ammonia combined with secreted hydrogen to again form ammonium. Now let's look at stage 2. Stage 2 is reabsorption of the ammonium across thick ascending limb. So now the ammonium, it's moving along the tubular fluid, see. And what happens in the thick ascending loop of Henle is that a significant amount of ammonium is reabsorbed, okay, See, it's getting reabsorbed via two mechanisms. One is transcellularly via the sodium potassium 2 chloride symporter, okay, with ammonium substituting for potassium, okay. So here, and the second is paracellularly driven by lumen positive transepithelial voltage in this segment. So by two mechanisms, one operating transcellularly through a sodium potassium chloride symporter and one operating paracellularly in this region due to lumen positive transepithelial voltage, basically what is happening? Ammonium is getting reabsorbed in this segment, in the thick ascending limb. Then what happens in stage 3? Okay. Now there is this, the ammonium reabsorbed from the thick ascending limb here accumulates in the interstitium, right? Where it exists in chemical equilibrium with ammonia. Okay, so now it's present here in the interstitium in equilibrium with ammonia. And the fourth stage is anionic diffusion and diffusion trapping in collecting ducts. Sorry. So now the cells of collecting duct are not permeable to ammonium, but permeable to ammonia ions. So from the medullary interstitium, okay, your the NH3 ions, they diffuse into the lumen of collecting duct. Okay, these diffuse into the lumen of collecting duct by a process called non-ionic diffusion and is protonated. So here they have diffused into the lumen by non-ionic diffusion and are protonated by the hydrogen ions secreted by the cells of collecting duct. Now, since the cells of collecting ducts are impermeable to ammonium, so NH4 ions, okay, they are impermeable, so NH4 ions are trapped in the lumen of the collecting duct. So they remain trapped here in the lumen itself, okay, and this is called as diffusion trapping, and they are excreted in the urine, okay. So for every ammonium ion excreted in the urine, a new bicarbonate, okay, is returned to the systemic circulation. All right. So excretion of ammonia ions can be used as a marker of proximal tubule glutamine metabolism, which in turn determines new bicarbonate formation. Okay, so this was the glutamine metabolism which was happening here in PCT. So ultimately, if you are able to measure how much ammonium ions are present in urine, because here they are not permeable, this area is not permeable to the ammonium, so they will be released into the urine. If you are able to know this quantity, then this tells you about the glutamine metabolism occurring in the PCT, and also in turn of how much new bicarbonate is formed. Okay, so just a few, so these are the stages of excretion of hydrogen ion as ammonium ion. Now there are some, just as we end this topic, just some important points about ammonium ion to note, that it's a major, by the way, these slides show the points that we just discussed if you want to have a look. So ammonium ion is a major uric acid, okay, and it's estimated that about half to 2/3 of body acid load is eliminated in form of ammonia ions. So for this reason, the renal regulation via ammonia excretion is very effective to eliminate large quantities of acids produced in the body. Okay, then the ammonia ions in urine is negligible until the urinary pH falls below 6. Below this urinary pH, the ammonia secretion increases linearly with the fall in pH. Okay. Unlike the phosphate buffer, the capacity of ammonia buffer is not limited by ammonia amount filtered in the glomerular filtrate. In states of chronic acidosis, for example, diabetic ketoacidosis, respiratory acidosis, amount of hydrogen excreted as ammonia ions may increase even to 10-folds due to an adaptive increase in ammonia synthesis. Since the pK value of this buffer system is 9, so your hydrogen excreted as ammonium ions does not contribute to titrable acidity of urine. So this is all about this topic. Let's just look at what are the important topics. Okay. Oops. Okay. So from this unit, the counter current system is extremely important. Okay. From theory or Viva point of view. And of course, you should know about both its components in detail: counter current multiplier, counter current exchanger. Okay. And all the factors that contribute to the counter current system. Okay. So that's a very, very important question, which is mainly the first part of this entire unit, actually. Then you can get short notes on osmotic diuresis, water diuresis, and what is water deprivation, what is water intoxication. These are just short notes, small topics. Yes, this is important. Hydrogen ion secretion, I told you even in the last lecture, is an important topic in itself. Okay. Hydrogen ion secretion in what forms and the mechanisms, whether in PCT, what are the mechanisms in distal tubule and collecting duct. Also about, all about the filtered bicarbonate is important. How is it reabsorbed? Where all it is reabsorbed? And what is the mechanism of reabsorption? How is the bicarbonate ion reabsorption regulated? Important. Even these are short topics, but important ones. Then generation of new bicarbonate is important. Okay. And this itself, the mechanism and excretion of hydrogen ion. What are the different ways? Okay. So these are the important topics from this unit. So what's the time? Okay. Almost 2 hours. So are there any doubts or queries at the moment? Please let me know. Or would you like me to end the session and send me the queries through Gauri later on? I'll be happy to answer them. Yes, I hope the topic is clear, and there is more that you will learn about when we go through the next unit, which is the acid-base balance. A lot of things will get cleared out there also. So any doubts or queries that you want me to address right now? Or please feel free to send them to Gauri. I'll be happy to respond to them. Okay. I'm not hearing anything back from you all. So shall we hang on? Shall we end the session? Okay, so I don't see any queries here, and I'm not hearing any response from you all. So I perhaps it would be best to end the session. So let me know if there's anything. Okay, any queries? Thank you very much, and hope you have a good day.